Now, I have been asked to do a very special lesson tonight. So, if you don't like it, don't blame me. Okay? But Ben and Will have asked that I spend some time talking about the evidences for the existence of God. And as I do that, I'm going to deal with it from a different perspective. It's not the perspective that most of you have grown up with. And I understand that. There's a reason, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. But as we begin, we start with Genesis 1. In the beginning, God. The most majestic verse in Scripture. A lot of you are asking now, well, okay, I believe already in God. So why in the world do I need to go through what you're getting ready to do tonight? Why do I need to study? We're going to try and see if this is going to... Oh, it works. Okay. Let me begin by noticing that Paul commanded Timothy that we are required to study. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, study to show yourself approved to God. Now, I want you to notice, it did not give you any limits on study. It did not say study the Old Testament, and that's all you need to do. Didn't say study the prophets, that's all you need to do. Didn't say study the New Testament, that's all you need to do. It said study. So, let's go to Mark chapter 12. In Mark chapter 12, we're introduced to the greatest of all of the commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. Now, if I were to ask you what's the greatest commandment, you wouldn't have had any trouble. You would have said love. And that's true. But Jesus qualifies that. He says you love God with your heart. You love God with all that's in you. But then he also says you love God with your mind. You have a responsibility to use your mind in the service of God. Every year as we begin our junior Bible class at Mars Hill, we begin with 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. That's sort of our text for our year. Here the Apostle Peter says, always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is within you in meekness or with meekness and fear. Now I want to call your attention to the opening part of that verse. Be ready to give a defense to everyone. Not just to those who already believe in the Bible. Not just to people who share a lot of your same beliefs. You have to be responsible enough to share the message of a belief in God with anyone. Folks, that includes scientists. That includes the millennials. That includes people today who know a great deal about science and math. Now, why do we do that? Why do we have to know that and be able to share with those folks? Because there are a lot of challenges that take place today. There's open defiance of God and Christian religion. Everywhere you look in the media, you're told there is no God. You're told that Christianity is a bogus religion. You're told that it has no truth associated with it. There's a deliberate ongoing censorship of anyone who believes in God and creation and Christianity. And there's open ridicule and attacks on Christians. So let me give you a couple of real quick examples. One of the more famous atheists of our time is a man by the name of Sam Harris. And in his book he says, belief in God is now little more than a branch of human ignorance. That's what you're facing today. In addition to that, perhaps the most well-known of all of the atheists is Richard Dawkins. He's an Englishman, and he makes this comment. He says, faith is an evil. Teaching children faith primes them to grow into potentially lethal weapons for future jihads or crusades. Faith can be very, very dangerous. Now notice what he concludes with. Deliberately to implant it into the vulnerable mind of an innocent child is a grievous wrong. Parents should no more be allowed to teach children about the literal truth of the Bible than to knock their children's teeth out. That's the world in which you and I live. There are a lot of people who hear those kinds of things, and they hear them from scientists. And if we can't answer the scientists, they think we're ignorant, we're illiterate. So we begin tonight not in the Bible, technically. We're going to be spending a lot of time tonight in math and science. Now, I understand most of you did not come here to hear math and science. But please understand, God commands us to use our minds. God tells us to study. And God says, you be able to defend your faith to anyone who asks you. That includes those who have backgrounds in math and science. That includes the millennials. That includes your grandchildren. That includes your children. They're going to hear this. Are you going to be able to help them when they do? The average person no longer believes in the Bible. I got my beginning in Christian evidences on a trip to Harvard University. We had gone there when I was in college. We were with the debate team at David Lipscomb. And while I was there, and when I went to all those tournaments, I always enjoyed talking with people. Now you got to understand, I was raised in Florence, Alabama, the buckle on the Bible Belt. Okay? I know what it's like to be a three-timer. You know what a three-timer is? Go to church Sunday morning, go to church Sunday night, go to church Wednesday night. But I'm also a three-timer plus, because my dad and mom determined I wasn't just going to go to those 3 meetings. If there was a VBS in the area, didn't matter whether it was Shared Avenue or not, I was going to it. If there was a meeting in the area, in addition, I was going to it. So I was raised in that kind of background. Now, they sent me to Mars Hill Bible School. I started in the 1st grade. I had a Bible class every day. I had chapel every day. And when I went to Lipscomb, I didn't do much to change my environment, because Lipscomb at that point was a very strong Christian college. Dr. Batzel Barrett Baxter was an excellent chairman of the Bible department. And when we got there, we had Bible every day. We had a chapel every day. Now, Nashville was also an area which was basically considered a Christian area. So for the first, say, 15 to 20 years of my life when I'm doing thinking, I'm around only people who are Christians. And then we got to Harvard. And I was just talking with a psychology major there on campus, and he was just curious, and we were having a good conversation. He said, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" I said, "I'm going to be a minister." And he looked at me with a scowl on his face, and he said, "You don't want to do that." And I said, "Well, yes, I do." He said, "There's no such thing as God. Why are you believing and teaching something like that?" And his words, "like that trash." I was stunned. Okay? I mean, that's the first time my faith had ever been challenged anywhere. And so I started to think, I said, the Bible says, before I got another word out, he says, "Man, I don't believe the Bible." And then he lambasted me for the next 5 minutes with math and science, for which I was not prepared. And finally, when he had said enough, he turned around, walked off, and said, "Ignorant Christian." That really changed me. Because when I got back to Lipscomb, I had to know. I was shaken. Am I doing what's right, or am I wasting my life? Got with Dr. Marlon Conley, who was chairman of he was a professor in the speech department, also worked as one of my debate coaches, and I told Dr. Conley what had happened. I said, "Dr. Conley, what should I do?" And he said, "Well, how were you raised here at Lipscomb?" I said, "Well, I was a debater." He said, "What'd you learn?" I said, "Well, I learned that you look at both sides and evaluate arguments." He said, "That's exactly right. Now you go do it." In other words, what he was saying to me is, if you have problems with these arguments, you can answer them. You go find the answer. So that's when I really began my study in Christian evidences. And it's now been 50 years. And I have not stopped studying it a single time since then. Now, I'm not going to give you 50 years worth tonight, so you can breathe easy. I do want you to note, however, this passage the answer is really, first of all, to the challenges. I've already told you it's going to be a lot of math and science and why. And I'm going to tell you this too because most of the college graduates are well versed in math and science, and it's an area that's really important. So question number 1, is there really a God who created life? And how can we be sure of that, and how good is the evidence? Famous British scientist named Lord Kelvin said, if you study science long enough and hard enough, you'll be forced basically to believe in God. And that's exactly what Paul was talking about in Romans chapter 1. What may be known of God is manifest. In other words, you can see God. Well, Paul, where can you see God? For God has shown His nature to people. Since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that were made. What'd you say, Paul? Paul said, if you want to believe in God, all you have to do is look around at the creation. You can find evidence for God in that creation. So, we can see evidence for God in creation. And we're going to see by beginning our study tonight with the overwhelming odds against the chance creation of a single cell. Single cell is the smallest living thing. So, that's where we start. We start with step 1. You have to get the right ingredients to make a cell. Now, I put a little acronym up there that you might know. Most of you who are younger will know this, CHONS. It stands for the elements that are necessary for life. Carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Those 6 elements are absolutely essential for life. Now, I knew all of that for a good while, except for phosphorus. I had no idea that phosphorus was necessary for life. In fact, a few years ago when I was talking to my classes at Mars Hill and we were studying this, I didn't include phosphorus. I didn't have a clue at that point that it was necessary. Because even scientists at that point hadn't discovered the importance of phosphorus of all things. So why is it such a special ingredient? Well, it's really the fly in the ointment of evolution. Here's the reason. The European Week of Astronomy and Space Science meeting this year, said that life as we know it is more unusual than previously thought because the universe doesn't have much phosphorus. I thought, wow, what in the world are they talking about? Well, let's see. Phosphorus is one of the rarest elements in the universe. But when it comes to the Earth, it is the 11th most common element on Earth. Now, let me just stop for a moment. It's not that way anywhere else. Scientists are able to do a lot in tracing the amount of elements and things that are found around stars, found on planets. They haven't found that anywhere else, and they've looked at a lot of planets. They've got over 4,000 planets out in the universe that they have found. Not a one of them is like Earth in that it has phosphorus. So, understanding that, it has become really, really interesting. Because now you've got to explain why the Earth, of all these different places, has that particular element when no one else does. Evolution News actually repeated back in April of 2018, about a year ago, Earth is so unique in its high phosphorus content that it may be unlikely that extraterrestrial life exists anywhere else in the universe. Step number 1 in forming a living cell, you've got to have the right elements. Why is it that only Earth has the right elements? Oh, many of them have 5 elements, not the 6th. That leads us to step 2. Once you get those elements, you have to combine them into what's called amino acids. Now, amino acids exist in 2 forms. For those of you who've had your biology recently, you'll know this, right and left-handed amino acids. All it amounts to is the order and the arrangement in which they're put together. Same number of molecules, same atoms, it's just put together differently. So, in living things, we have about 20 different kinds of amino acids. All of them are left-handed. Now, the significance of that is this, and I'm going to show you a diagram first of all. This particular illustration shows you a left and a right hand, okay? Notice that the thumb on the left or right hand is unique because that's the location of that single tiny hydrogen element. When it's built together, it sticks out. If it's left-handed, it sticks out like the thumb on the left hand. If it's right-handed, it sticks out like the thumb on the right hand. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because we now know that life exists in a situation where it only uses left-handed amino acids. Now, you can make amino acids, you can throw elements together, you can have all sorts of mixtures. You can find amino acids everywhere. You can find them on comets, on meteorites, you can find them in the ocean, on the sands. You can find them just about everywhere, even in space. And there's an equal mixture of right and left-handed. But when it comes to the living cell, only left-handed. Why in the world is that important? Well, let me get some scientists to tell you. Walter James Ramini of Michigan says in his book, The Biotic Message, protein from life uses only left-handed amino acids. And John Maddox, in his book, Revolution in Biology, it is an intellectual thunderbolt that life should contain only left-handed amino acids. In other words, why only left-handed? Same atoms, same elements. Difference is the side on which that one little hydrogen atom sticks out. Why is that so important? Fact of the matter is, we really don't know. You may have heard the name Linus Pauling, famous Nobel Prize winner. Even Dr. Pauling says this is something that's just amazing. He says everywhere we look, doesn't matter where you look. If it's living, it's only left-handed amino acids. Now, let's take this to the next step. How many of these amino acids do you have to make a living cell? Well, first of all, how many do you have to make one protein, which is the next step up from a living cell? Bird and Morowitz in the Journal of Molecular Biology teach us that the smallest known living thing is a little bitty organism called Mycoplasma hominis H39. I'm sure you've heard of that all your life, right? Now, it contains 625 different kinds of protein. 625 different kinds of protein. Now, these mycoplasmas, these tiny little cells, are only quasi-independent. In other words, it looks like they're alive, and yet it also seems like they've got to have other things there before they can live. So whether it can live on its own, we're not even sure. Now, there's a smaller organism called Mycoplasma genitalium, but we know it can't function on its own, and it contains 482 proteins. Now, I want you to see the number here. 562,000 base pairs of DNA in that one tiny, non-functioning little cell. So, what's the significance of all this? This is a book that's just been released within the last month. He is talking about the massive progress that's been made in biology. This gentleman is a professor of biology in Brazil. The book is endorsed by Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, physics, biology, and biophysics. 4 Nobel Prize winners endorsed this book. So it tells you this guy is fairly intelligent. Now notice what he says. There's been a lot of discovery in biology recently. However, it says this points beyond blind evolutionary processes, and it looks like the working of a great mind. That's God. Doesn't look like chance processes. It looks like there's a God. Now, Dr. Eberlin begins his study in that little book by talking about cell membranes. Now, I am sure most of you have not spent a great deal of time looking at cell membranes. However, they're much, much more complicated than most people understand. Now, cell membranes are 100% essential to life. You've got to have them. You take away a cell membrane, any part of it, and by the way, that's what surrounds the cell. Take away any part of it, that cell dies. So let's continue with Eberlin's book. Eberlin says these cell membranes had to be there from the beginning. He says they're surrounded by a chemical shield, that's the membrane, but had to be there from the start. Didn't evolve. In order for that first cell to live, it had to already be in place. And that's what he's saying. Now, there is no known cell that can survive without that membrane. And there are 4 requirements that are listed there for that cell membrane. Requirement number 1, it's got to have a chemical shield to protect the cell. Number 2, it's got to have selective protein channels, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Because if you don't have that, you don't have life. Then, number 3, you've got to have a molecular shield. And number 4, you've got to have phospholipids and aquaporins. Again, words that you're probably not familiar with. So, bear with me, I'm almost finished with this. Let's go back to Eberlin's book. Eberlin says, it seems then from all the biochemical knowledge we have, that the cell's membrane had to be delivered on time. What he means by that is it all had to be in place at the beginning, every bit of it. And then he continues by talking about these things called aquaporins. Let's see, am I on the right page? Am I? Oh, okay, all right. Can't see it from over here. Now, what in the world are aquaporins? Well, they're interesting because aquaporins is what allows the passage of water into the cell. Now, we all know that we've got to have water. That's understandable. I mean, without water, we die. All of us have water. All cells have water. There's a problem with that. Water is H2O, 2 elements of hydrogen. And when hydrogen begins to pass into the cell, it sets up what's called a proton wire. You know what an electrical wire is. You've seen the current. Current runs up and down that electrical wire. So in order to get the water into the cell, you have to have those aquaporins and those protein channels. Protons then form. They're positively formed. Here's the problem. Inside the cell, it's all negative. Charge is negative. You introduce a lot of positive in there, it destroys the cell. So how in the world are you going to get water into the cell without bringing all that extra stuff that's going to kill the cell? It's the water problem that they're talking about. So with that in mind, and again, stay with me, I'm almost done. We talked about this right now. Can't use just what we call a simple gate, open, close, let the water in and out. You got to stop those positively charged hydrogen ions. And the aquaporins do it. How do they do it? Because they have one special amino acid. That amino acid is known as asparagine, and it's set at the perfect location. And the minute a water molecule starts to go through that channel to transport water into the cell through the membrane, that little amino acid twists that hydrogen molecule, and when it twists the molecule, it prevents the hydrogen proton from getting in. got to have it. See how intricate it is? How in the world do you explain something like that without saying there's mind involved? It took a Nobel Prize winner to figure it out. If it took a Nobel Prize winner to figure it out, doesn't it require a mind also to make it in the first place? They've actually figured out, and Dr. Eberlin concludes by saying, the odds of this happening by chance would be 1 chance in 10 to approximately the 74,000th power. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay? Let's go on. Now then, finished with the science for right now, let's go to math. Yay! Everybody loves math, right? Okay. When I was in high school, I learned regular math. When I got to college, I learned this strange new thing called new math, which never survived, by the way. I don't know why we learned it, but we did. I don't remember it, but anyway, it's no longer around. But I've been used to just plain numbers, okay? But we live in a world that's so massive, that things are so big and so little, that you have to have a special nomenclature, a special vocabulary just to describe things. So the first thing I learned was powers of 10. And this book on the screen here is by Philip and Phyllis Morrison, a Scientific American book, and it's simply entitled Powers of 10. If you would like to do some reading on that, it's easy to follow. Now, powers of 10 are easy to understand. Okay, here's how you do it. If I say something is 10 to the first power, what I'm saying is it's a 1 followed by 1 0. 10, a 1, first power, 1 0. That's the same as our number 10. If you're looking at the number 100, that's a 1 with 2 zeros. So that's 10 to the second power, a 1 with 2 zeros after it. Now, if you're talking about 1,000, you got 3 zeros after it. That's 10 to the third power. If you've talked 10 to the 21st power, you're talking about a 1 with 21 zeros after it. Now, that's hard to write out. And what do you call it? I don't know what 10 to the 21st power is when you look at that number. It's not quadrillions, it's not billions. I don't know what it is. So we invented this nomenclature, powers of 10. And as we began to study, we realized that any number that's larger than 10 to the 15th power, or excuse me, that's 10 to the 18th power, that's the number up there, 1 with 18 zeros. That's the number of seconds in 15 billion years. That's a lot of them, okay? So we began to realize these things are really, really large. Now, what about the universe? It's massive. If you measure the universe from one edge to the other in inches, not light years, not miles, in inches, you're talking about 10 to the 28th power. That's a 1 with 28 zeros. Now, when you see 10 to the 28th, you think on that 28, oh, 28, that's small. No, it's massive. It's a huge, huge number. Now, the smallest thing that we have are protons, neutrons, and electrons. And if you look at the universe, every asteroid, every comet, every meteorite, every planet, every star, every speckle of dust in the universe, you are looking at 10 to the 80th protons, neutrons, and electrons. That's the number. 1 with 80 zeros after it. Now then, if you're talking about 2 universes, all you do is make it 2 times 10 to the 80th. Now, with that in mind, suppose you want to do a lot more than that. Suppose you want to talk about 100 universes. Well, all you do is multiply by the zeros. So if you 2 zeros added to 10 to the 80th, that becomes 10 to the 82nd. That's the number of protons, neutrons, and electrons in 100 universes. It's a massive number. So, now then, in order for us to understand life itself, we've got to understand that life requires a bare minimum of these amino acids in order to produce a living cell. So let's talk chance. We're going to try to understand probability science. Dr. Emil Borrell of the University of Southern California wrote the article on probability science that appeared in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And Dr. Borrell says there are some chances, and remember, this is a scientist, he's not a preacher. There's some chances that are so small that they'll never happen. Now, he said it, I didn't. Never. Not maybe they won't happen, probably they won't. He says no, they will never happen. There's the number up there. Okay? Now, when Darwin wrote his Origin of Species back in 1859, he thought the cell was very simple. Cell is not simple at all. It is very complex, extremely, amazingly intricate, has all sorts of information systems that are found in it. So, what are the odds that you could get enough amino acids and line them up in one place, same time, to produce one protein molecule? One chance in 10 to the 161st power. What do you have? One protein. One. Now remember, when we were talking about that smallest known living thing, it has 625 different kinds of protein. That's the chance to get one. And by the way, those numbers change every year. The latest number that I've seen now says it's up to 10 to the 180th power. That's because every time people discover something, it makes it even more complex and even more difficult to happen by accident. Finally, people have estimated the chance of getting 239 proteins. Now, I'm not even going to bore you with why 239. One chance in 10 to the 119,000th power. You want to see the number? Oops. That's the number. That's 119,000 zeros. Now, I only wrote one page and I Xeroxed the rest, okay? So, but think about, that's the chance of just getting a small number of protein. Not enough for life. What about a single living cell? Dr. Henry Quasler of Yale actually figured it out, and there it is. Round it off. One chance in 10 to the 3 trillionth power. Yes, I believe in God. I believe very strongly in God because math and science forces me to believe in God. That's what Lord Kelvin was talking about when he says you study science long enough, it will force you to believe in God. And it does. Dr. Fred Hoyle, who was knighted 2 times by the Queen of England and president of the British Academy of Sciences, says the odds that life occurred by accident would be far greater than a typhoon blowing through a junkyard and leaving a perfectly flyable Boeing 747 jet airliner. Not going to happen. So I'm going to skip past the next one. I hear this all the time. Well, okay, I know it's a big number, but given enough time, anything can happen. No, that's not possible. Given enough time, anything will happen is just not true. Dr. James Coppage, who is a professor of biochemistry at Cal State University at Northridge, has written, an amoeba traveling at the speed of 1 inch every 15 billion years could haul 10 to the, and I think that's 54th, I can't see the number, universes, an atom at a time across the known diameter of the universe during the time which would be required to produce one protein. And you got one. So what do you do with it? Stick it under a rock and wait for another one to come. You don't have enough time. Chance evolution simply doesn't have enough time. The most liberal estimate is 10 to the 13th billion, or 10 to the 13th, well, anyway, you got the point. 13 billion years. You can't find anything today that says it's older than that. Now, maybe in times past, but not today. They say the universe is 13 billion years old. You don't have enough time to get one molecule. Yes, I believe in God. So how do atheists respond to that? I love this. This is recent. This is a response that comes from a professor at Columbia University. And he says, I know what I can do. I can explain to you how you can do all this. I'm going to come up with a formula that tells you how to make a cell. And he did. And he said, well, here on Earth, it's really hard to build a cell. So somewhere, notice that, somewhere, maybe we could find the right ingredients that could create life. That's his answer. So where's the evidence for that? None. I mean, I can tell you there's a purple spaghetti monster in the back of the room. Can you disprove that? Well, no. It's invisible. Okay, so you can't disprove it. But you don't believe it. Professor at Caltech, when he heard this, says that's a comic book idea. And he's a fellow evolutionist. So with that in mind, everywhere you look, you got problems. Now, even Professor Scharf says, okay, I'm being kind of sneaky here. I think it's one of the beautiful things about it. If you write the equation for the origin of life this way, in other words, his way, you don't necessarily have to worry about all the fine details. In other words, set up your equation so it's loaded in your favor. Don't pay any attention to what the real requirements are, and you can work it out. Doesn't work that way. Dr. Anthony Flew, one of the world's most noted atheists, started out to write a book, There Is No God. He ended up writing a book, There Is a God. And basically what he says here at the bottom is all of these new understandings that have come about have given us a whole new amount of knowledge about what's going on in the universe. And this is his conclusion. And I love the conclusion. At the very end, he was asked, why did you change from believing in atheism to believing in God? He says, I have to go where the evidence leads. Back to Lord Kelvin. Study science long enough, strongly enough, it'll force you to believe in God. Now, the overwhelming odds against chance creation of life on earth we're going to talk about for a minute. Look at Psalm 19. This is David's psalm. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They haven't used no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth and their words to the ends of the world. In other words, what Paul was saying, look at what's been made. You can see God. So what do we now know? In order for life to exist, you've got to have the right kind of galaxy. There are 7 kinds of galaxies. Only one, a spiral galaxy, will support life. Don't have time to go into the reason why. Just sort of take my word for it right now. Then, in addition to that, you've got to have the right kind of star. If you look in the universe, there are all sorts of stars. There are main sequence stars, 11 classes. Down at the bottom are their numbers, or letters rather. You want to know how to remember that, I'll tell you. Oh, be a fine girl, kiss me quick, right now, smack. You can now remember the 11 main classes of stars. Okay? However, what we have to have for life to exist is a class G star. The others won't work. And again, don't have enough time to go into why tonight. Let's just simply say, if you want to talk about it, I'll be glad to. Then you've got to have the right kind of planet. That planet has got to be a special distance from the star. It's called a CHZ, Continually Habitable Zone, and it's small. By the way, they've reduced that just this summer. They used to think it was much larger than it is. This summer, they've narrowed it down even more. In addition, you've got to have a particular kind of planet. It's got oxygen and water. You've got to have a thin crust, and you've got to have a moon. That moon has got to be large enough to stabilize the rotation of the planet. That's exactly what our moon does. It keeps our planet from spiraling down and flying into the sun, because the gravity and the spin of the moon is crucial. It also controls our tides. Without the moon, you would have no ocean tides. Without ocean tides, you would have no plankton. Without plankton, you would have no life. How did it happen to be just exactly right? You can't find another example like that in the universe. At least they haven't yet. Oh, they find a lot of moons, some bigger, some smaller, none like ours. Then in addition to that, they have found out now that even the force of gravity, which has been measured, has been fine-tuned. It's got to be a very precise amount. So how much is this fine-tuning involved? Well, the odds of fine-tuning the force of gravity so that life exists is similar to getting a stack of dimes, piling all over the earth, and then using that stack all the way to the moon. That's 239,000 miles away. Then do the same for 48 billion other Earths. That's the chance of getting gravity fine-tuned like it is for life. So Carl Sagan, even though he's an atheist, says it's easy to see that only a very restricted range of laws of nature are consistent with galaxies and stars and planets and life and intelligence. We now know that the Van Allen radiation belts that surround the Earth are absolutely essential for life because they block high-energy particles. You've probably heard about solar storms, where the sun emits this huge amount of solar energy, comes bursting out in these high-energy particles, and they're worried because they say, oh, it'll tear up the satellites and it'll cause our communication system to go down. Well, Van Allen radiation belts pretty much stop that. Phys.org says that there are solar tsunamis like that go on all the time. But the Van Allen radiation belts save the Earth. How is it that it's that way? If the universe had less mass, life would not be possible. If it had more, life would not be possible. Dr. Paul Davies says, it seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Mass of the universe, fine-tuned. Okay, let me show you what I mean. It's fine-tuned to the point of a grain of sand. All right, I got a grain of sand. 1 grain of sand. No, I don't actually have it, but imagine I do. I've got a grain of sand. Okay? Now, I'm going to take this grain of sand and I'm going to deposit it somewhere on the earth. I'm going to give you one chance. I'm going to blindfold you. You have to pick the grain of sand. That's the odds of getting a universe fine-tuned like we have. Oh, and by the way, a side step here. Back in the book of Genesis and in the book of Jeremiah, God uses an analogy. He talks about something as numerous as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky. Well, guess what? Astronomers now estimate there are 10 to the 23rd stars in the sky. Our geologists say there are 10 to the 23rd grains of sand on the earth. How is it that Jeremiah and Genesis both got something like that exactly right? And then you got to deal with location of the earth. If it's too far away from various parts of the galaxy, life is not possible. If it's too close, life is not possible. It's got to fit in what we call that continually habitable zone that's the life zone. Dr. James Tressel says, if I were a religious man, I would say that everything we have learned about life in the past 20 years shows that we are unique and therefore special in God's sight. That's coming from an atheist. But he says, I've got to admit, when I look at the evidence, that's what it shows. Dr. Alan Sandage says, we can't understand the universe in any clear way without the supernatural. That's God. The size of our sun is specific. It's got to be exactly right. If you make it much larger, it's a problem. Make it much smaller, it's a problem. Sir Francis Crick says, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. Location, location, location. We used to think Jupiter and Saturn were just big stars in the sky. We now know that the placement there in that particular part of the universe actually protects the Earth because they suck up comets and asteroids of any size that come through our atmosphere. And they're positioned in just such a way that they either deflect them away from the Earth or they can slam into those gaseous planets and just be dissolved. Let me skip past that because I'm about to run out of time here. and y'all have to just pardon me. What time is it, by the way? What? I have, okay, all right. Let's just stop, okay? Y'all know me, I'm loud, I'm long-winded, I could go on all night. If you've got any questions, I'll try to answer them. I didn't get to the second part of the lesson tonight, which was all these nice little, cute little creatures. I love to talk about the bombardier beetle, the little blue butterfly, and all of the other things that are so amazing, the migratory pattern of the golden plover. Again, you want to talk about it, stop by, I'll talk to you. Have a great evening. Max?